In the last video, we saw how to create arrays in JavaScript. Now we'll see how to get and set values into our arrays. So far, we've seen how to construct arrays with different initial values. However, the real power of arrays come from when you can read values or set values into your array. The arrays in JavaScript have a very simple syntax for retrieving values as well as setting values. So let's start off with this variable myArray. It contains 4 different elements: a string hello, the number 42, the Boolean value true, and a function. And this function takes one argument and returns that argument times 2. So we have it stored in myArray. And if we go back to our browser and we refresh and take a look at myArray, we can see that it's stored just like we wrote it out in its initialization literal. So let's actually work on retrieving values from this array. Now, arrays are accessed by something called an index. And this is how far from the beginning of the array that we want to grab our element. The index always starts with 0. So if we take a look at myArray, since we have 4 objects, there are going to be 4 different indexes that we can get and set from. So if we wanted to get the string hello out of myArray, well, that's going to be stored at index 0. Now this is an important thing to note, and it can be confusing because we may want to start counting from the number 1 and then 2, 3, 4. However, indexes in JavaScript are 0 based, meaning the first element of our array is stored in index 0, the second element is stored at index 1, and so on. The easy way to think about this is how far from the beginning you want to pull out your element. So since hello is 0 elements from the beginning, since it is the beginning, it makes sense that it's index 0. So let's see how we can actually retrieve the value from myArray and store it into another variable. So let's create a variable called word, and we're going to set it equal to myArray, and this is how we get individual values out of our array. Again, we're going to use these square braces. However, this is not creating a new array as our original initialization did. Instead, the square brackets represent that we're going to retrieve from an index, and inside of these square brackets, we put the number of our index, in our case 0. So we're saying we want to get from myArray index 0, and that's on the right-hand side of our assignment, which should return the value hello, which we're then storing into a variable called word. So let's go back to our browser and refresh, and if we inspect the value of our variable called word, we get the value hello. And we can do this again. We could say var answer equals myArray, and then the index 1. This will pull out the number 42 and store it in answer. So if we check out answer after refreshing, we'll see it's 42. And we can see that even things like functions can be stored and retrieved very easily. So let's say we want to store this function that doubles numbers into a variable called doubler. And we'll just grab myArray. And let's see what the index of our function is going to be. So starting from hello is 0, 1, 2, and our function is at index 3. So we'll grab myArray of index 3. And now doubler actually contains a function. So if we did console.log, we can actually call doubler because it is a function and pass it a value, so 10. So we're calling this function that's stored in the variable doubler. We're calling it with the argument 10, which will be bound to a if we look in the actual function definition. And the return value is going to be a times 2. We saw a little bit of this in Introduction to Programming. It's a very basic function. So what should we see when we actually load the page? We should see the number 20. So we can see that even though we defined our function inside of our array, we're able to retrieve it using the square brackets and an index, and we're even able to call a function that we pulled out of it. So we still have access to answer, which is 42, and word. So what happens if we call myArray, and remember the last index was 3, what happens if we retrieve a value that's not in there, let's say index 100? Well, it's going to return us the value undefined, and we remember this from earlier. This just means that there is no value defined for index 100. Now this is actually quite nice because in other languages, if we try to pull out a value from an array that exceeds its length, we might get some sort of error. However, we'll see in a moment that JavaScript arrays can expand and contract as we add elements to them. And if we pull out an index that does not exist in our array, it'll simply return us undefined. This makes sense because we have not defined the value for the index 100, but it's not an error because maybe later we do want to define that value. So let's see how we could set a value. Now I'm going to keep my array, but now we're going to worry about setting it. So we remember my array is hello 42, true, and our doubler function. But let's say we wanted to change the number 42 to a different number. So what we can do there is we'll do an assignment. So on the left-hand side of our equal sign is going to be my array, and then what index we want to assign into. I want to overwrite our 42, and remember that's at index 1 because it's the second value. And now we can assign any value we want. Let's say 144. And we can retrieve it again by doing our new answer with an underscore. And we can use the my array sub 1. So we're doing our subscript there of 1. And if we take this code and we run it, if we take a look at new answer, we'll see it's a 144. If we take a look at my array, we can see it's now storing the value 144 where it used to have 42. This means that we can change the values of our arrays at any time simply by assigning to them, much like how we retrieve from them. But what happened to our answer here? We said answer equals my array sub 1. When we did that, the index of 1 was the value 42. However, now it's 144. Let's take a look at answer, our original answer. We can see it's 42. That means whenever we do an assignment like this, we're actually grabbing the value out of it and storing it into answer. We're not saying that answer will always equal the first element of our my array. Instead, we're saying answer equals my array index 1 as it is now. If it changes later, we're not going to update the value of our variable called answer because we only care about what it was when we retrieve the value the first time. So just be aware of that. When you retrieve a value out of an array, it's going to copy the value out into a new variable. And if you change it later, it will not affect that variable that you previously stored it into. So we remember that right now my array only has 4 elements, which means the highest index is 3. So what would happen if we assign into an index that doesn't exist? We could do my array, and the next index that does not exist would be the index 4. And we could say a new string. Well, let's take a look. We're going to run this. And remember, we've run all the way down to my array sub 4 equals a new string. So if we take a look at my array now, we see we've actually added into what would be index 4 a new string. But what would happen if we said 14, let's say, for my array's index? Let's save it out and refresh. And let's take a look at my array. Now we can see that the representation has changed a little bit. For index 0, 1, 2, and 3, we have our original values, but now it looks like we have a bunch of undefined values until we reach index 14, where we have a new string. So if we set a high index, it's going to fill the intermediate values with undefined, which makes sense if we take a look at my array of index 10, which is between 14 and our other defined indices. We can see that it's going to be undefined. And this is much like the behavior if we pick a rather large number that's outside of the range, like 100. Again, it's undefined. And that makes sense because there's no value defined for that index in our array, so if you try to retrieve it, it's going to give you undefined. So one neat little trick is if you want to add to the end of your array, we can actually use something we saw earlier called our length property. So remember when we added to the end of our array, I'm going to change this back to 4. Since there were already 4 elements in it, the next unused index would be 4. So if we refresh and take a look at my array, we see that it added it to the end of our array. Well, remember, 4 is also our length. So if we were to replace 4 with the expression my array.length, we can see that the exact same effect happens. So we can see my array now has a new string. And this is awesome because now we can always add to the end of our array without having to know ahead of time what the index would actually be. We can dynamically calculate it. And this also means between these square brackets where we're defining the index, we can have any expression or variable that we want. So we don't have to have a number like 3. We could do myArray.length, which at this time would be 4. Or we could even do something like answer, which would be 42. But if we take a look at myArray where the index is myArray.length, this is nice because it'll always add to the end of our array. So if we do it a bunch of times, we can always refresh, and now we'll see it should be added 3 times to the end of my array. That's because every time it evaluates myArray.length, it's been increased 1 time from the previous line, so it continues to add to the end of the array. So that's a nice little pattern. Anytime you want to add to the end of an array, you can just do myArray with the index of myArray.length. Because the indexing starts at 0, the length will be the next index that's unused in the array. So now we've seen how to get and set values to our array. In the next video, we'll learn about some methods and properties that are available on our arrays.